Hello, everyone. This is Jeffrey Kerr. I'm here today with a very special guest. She worked alongside a legendary theater maker, Joseph Papp, as he founded the Public Theater and was named the theater's Director of New Works Development. She married Joe Papp in 1976. They were together until his death in 1991. Her memoir, Public Private: My Life with Joe Papp at the Public Theater, will be published by Applause Books in October 2023. Please welcome Gail Merrifield Papp.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
To start things off, would you mind telling us about the book?
The book is a memoir about my working life and marriage to Joe, which spans the years from 1965, which is when I met him and started working for the New York Shakespeare Festival, to 1991, which is when he died. It also encompasses the first quarter century of the Public Theater, which launched in 1966, opened in 1967 with the first production of the musical Hair. So that's the span of my book. Those are the bookends of the years that I write about.
And how did the opportunity for you to write a memoir come about?
The opportunity presented itself in my own mind. No one asked me to do it. A couple of decades after Joe was gone, I felt that, his prominence in the news, which had been considerable during the time he was active at the theater, was fading away, as such things do. And I thought he should be remembered for what he accomplished and for what he represented and stood for. So I had the idea first to write something that would be a compilation of things he had written and said and so forth. So I started compiling. But Joe could have been a writer, but he didn't want to write. He wanted to be a producer. And so his writing is disjointed. It's for different occasions, different people with different modes of thought and so forth. It was very hard to pull it all together, even though I had help with it. So after about a decade of trying to pull it together, I thought, this is not working. And so I thought, well, perhaps I can write an account of these years instead. It was difficult for me to get started because I'd never written a book, but I started. I kept at it. I had a lot of help, a lot of editorial input from a variety of people. I finally got a book done. The whole process that every writer goes through, trying to find an agent, then finding a book publisher, and that took a few years also, but it finally happened. Very pleased and amazed that it did, but I'm very, very happy that it did.
What was it like for you getting to write it?
At first, when I started to write my own book about these years, it was psychologically interesting because I sat in front of my computer and my mind was a blank, even though I knew I'd had this amazing experience of being with Joe for those years, more than a quarter century, 26 years. And I couldn't think of a damned thing to write. I was just frozen. And I had a very dear friend who was a professional writer, and she was staying with me at the time. She said, all right, you sit in front of that thing until you write, at least one page. And so I sat there for a couple of hours and nothing happened. Absolutely nothing happened. I thought, well, this is psychologically interesting for me, but what does it mean? I know I had a rich life, and why is it I can't put a word on the page? For whatever reason, I had to get through that. And I finally wrote about a page. Took me about 5 hours. She liked what I'd written. She said, I have to keep going. And so I did. And I got past that kind of psychological impasse that there was nothing I had to say, to knowing that I had a great deal I wanted to say. And I felt very motivated about accomplishing that and trying to finish it, which I finally did. But the process itself was a learning process for me. I'd never written a book before. And I was trying to write one at a later stage in life, not when I was 21 years old. So it was a challenge. It was a real challenge. I had to do a lot of late learning of skills that I appreciated tremendously in other people my whole life and understood in other people, but had not acquired myself to do. So I had to learn how to do those things. And that was interesting. It was a major learning process. I finally managed to get it done.
Yeah, and what do you hope readers end up taking away from the memoir?
Oh, that's a very big question. What I hope they'll take away from it, especially in this 21st century that we're now in, is some understanding of a person who devoted his life life to serving people through the arts, primarily theater, with a very fiercely democratic model for what he did. Joe often said, I don't just produce plays. I'm not interested in just producing plays or musicals. He wanted theater to bring something to the people. Initially, it was for free. He wanted free theater for the people, which he created in Central Park with the Free Shakespeare in the summer. Then when he started the public theater, he would have liked to have had that free, but it's not possible because it's a building that houses 6 small theaters that he created, and none of them are going to pay their way. So you have to raise enormous amounts of money to support a nonprofit model of that kind. So he wanted to continue his desire to have what's on stage and the people that create it resemble the population of the city, which meant a broad population of many different kinds of people. He had brought that to doing Shakespeare in the Park, where he really initiated non-traditional, or what was then called colorblind casting. So he continued that at the public theater, and he wanted the audience to be able to strongly identify with who they saw on stage, as well as what was being written by writers for the stage. That was a very interesting aspect of working with Joe, because his artistic mission and his social conscience were totally interwoven. They weren't separate aspects of his work or his personality. They were intensely interwoven. He never separated the two in the way he moved forward with his plans. So it created a kind of social mission at the theater that was beyond just stating a mission. It was part of the DNA of the theater, the people in it, and the artists who also wrote for it and performed in it. Very special. It still exists to this day. Somehow he left his DNA imprint along those lines. It changes over the course of decades and years and with generations, but essentially it's the same DNA. I find that really quite amazing, and I thought it was really worth writing about, especially with the problems we have in this century, especially right now in our country. I thought he has something to look at that's existed in the past, in the fairly recent past, that's worth considering and taking some courage from and applying in certain unique, special ways from other people to what we have to deal with now. And theater is part of that. I really wanted to get that across in some way if I could, but not through preaching it, just through example.
Going back to the beginning, how did you first meet Joe Papp?
I was working in the early 60s. I was working as a play reader at the first Lincoln Center Theater, Repertory Theater was called then. It just opened in, I think, in 65 or 66. So I was hired as a play reader. Elia Kazan was the director in charge, and Robert Whitehead was the producer in charge. And Harold Clerman, who was also one of my mentors, was a director there. He was the founder of the group theater, very influential guy I liked. And so I worked there for a year. Then all of a sudden, Lincoln Center Theater's board of directors decided in its corporate wisdom to fire all these immensely talented people and bring in a pair of directors from the West Coast. And so they fired the entire staff, including myself. So I was out of a job and looking for work. And I wanted to work in the theater again, although I had a rather meager background in it. But I had numbers of people, women in my family, who'd been actresses. I'd known 3 of them. It was a kind of a family interest on my part in staying in theater. I wrote to a whole bunch of producers. I didn't know any of them, but I sent out 80 letters, which I had to type, individually on my Olivetti portable typewriter. I got a phone call one day from somebody that said he worked for the New York Shakespeare Festival. I'd never heard of it because I'd only written to people who were listed as producers in the then telephone book, a big volume that we all consulted. I went up there for an appointment, and he was the general manager. He hired me as a temporary person for the summer to write the bios of certain people were performing at the Delacorte Theater in Central Park. Joe was then directing Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida at the Delacorte Theater, and he needed someone to take his notes during the previews. So for some reason, he asked me to take his notes. So that's how I got to know him. I sat with him at the Delacorte Theater. It was the first time I'd ever been there. And I took his notes. He spoke very rapidly, low voice. He was very agitated about what he saw on stage that he didn't like that was going on. And so he would give me these notes, and I'd write them in the dark. Discuss the play a little bit with him and his approach to it. Usually in this play, the Troilus is the hero who is an unblemished and honorable guy. He loves Cressida, but she is usually portrayed as a no good Nick who consorts with the enemy. So Joe had a different view. He said, I don't look at it that way. He said, my view, Troilus is the cad and Cressida is his victim. So I thought that was very interesting. We started to discuss the play a little bit. I found his take on the play, which I hadn't read before, really, really fascinating. But he didn't impose his view on the actor portraying Troilus. He just pointed out a few lines that Troilus has, which are kind of a little creepy if you think about them. And the actor on his own made an adjustment that added more nuance and richness to his characterization as a result of it. So that was how I got to know Joe a little bit. Since I'd been hired just for the summer, when the fall came, he wanted me to stay on and asked me to continue with his Shakespeare Festival operation, which operated out of a hotel at that time on a permanent basis. So I said, okay. But during my first year working for him, he had gotten the idea that he didn't want to do just Shakespeare all the time. He'd been doing it for a number of years. And so he had an idea of a year-round theater rather than a summer operation that would be doing new work. And that was the birth of the Public Theater. During my first year, actually, at the organization, he acquired the Astor Library Landmark building downtown, which is a big Italianate Renaissance building, 3 stories tall, quite beautiful. But inside the building, it was very derelict. So he had an idea that he would acquire the building after he got it declared a landmark, so it wouldn't be torn down, which was about to be torn down, but he managed to get a stay of execution. He had a vision of 6 theaters that he would build inside the structure. Once the area of the Astor Library building had been cleaned up and renovated to a little bit of an acceptable condition, we were able to move in and set up our offices. No theater existed yet, but we moved in. That was 1966. Soon afterwards, the construction of the very first theater, which was the Ansbacher, began. And then the following year, 67, Hare opened at the Public Theater in that space. And eventually 5 other theaters were constructed within the building, one by one. And that was the beginning.
How do you look back at your time with the Public Theater?
Obviously, it was an amazing experience. I didn't know that all of this history was going to be ahead of me. I had no idea of it at the time. My parents were writers. I come from a family both of writers and actors. So I've always had intense interest in writing and in writers. So I was immensely interested in the playwrights that started to come around to the theater because we advertised or let it be known that we wanted to produce new work by new American writers, that we were interested in a broad range of experiences of different kinds of people, which included Black, Latino, Asian American, also women, because this is the cusp of the women's liberation movement, and women had not been very well represented in the theater except in the acting area. But in terms of playwrights, directors, etc., they were not well represented at all at that time. I became quite involved in that, got to know numbers of writers, encouraged them in their work, brought it to Joe's attention, initially on a very small level, but gradually as people got to know about us, they submitted work and came around to the theater and wanted to see what was possible. And there weren't very many of us. There were 12 people on the staff that moved into the theater. So we were 12 people there in that big building. And by default, I was the only person then in Joe's office. He asked me to be his assistant. So he was assistant, but there was nobody else there except me in his office. People sent him scripts personally addressed to him. They came in the mail bag that was put on my desk every morning. So since I'd read scripts before elsewhere, I started reading scripts. And then when it was too many scripts for me to handle, I engaged some script readers. But it was all out of Joe's office initially on a very personal basis. And that was how I got into the development of new work at the Public Theater. After a while, we did create a script department for development of new works, but we didn't have that then. The script department was Joe's name for a few years.
And you were responsible for some of the public's best remembered productions. Among them were For Colored Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough, The Normal Heart, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, and many others. Which shows would you say you are most proud of?
Well, I had a certain relationship to For Colored Girls, not in its development, but in my appreciation of it when its director brought it to me in script form. I helped to arrange a performance of it at the Public Theater after it had closed at another theater after a very good run, but it wanted to have a future life. And the hope was that it could be a co-production with Woody King Jr.'s New Federal Theater and the public so that the performances could go on and more people could see it. So I helped to arrange that. One time reading at the Public Theater, which is, of course, more than a reading because the cast, including Zaki, had been performing it, so it was like a performance. And it absolutely knocked me out. I was just so overwhelmed and moved and impressed by it. It was really quite an experience. So was Joe. His response was just as intense as mine. And so to that extent, I became a very vocal supporter of it. And then later on, I became a friend of Zaki. I felt very close to her. So did Joe. With respect to The Normal Heart, it's a little different. There I was intensely involved in the development of the script. The playwright Larry Kramer loved to say it had been rejected by everybody. And when he came with it to the Public Theater, it was a very long play. It was, playing time we estimated might have been 4 hours. And it was kind of a jumbled confluence of two ideas that he had for a play. One was about his brother, who was a straight brother, and he was a gay brother. The other was his experience as a co-founder of the Gay Men's Health Crisis, from which he was then fired for his flaming political engagement with various public figures that the board of the Gay Men's Health Crisis didn't like at that time. So he wrote that play in the aftermath of that experience, but he still had these two plays that were kind of conflated with each other. So it was very, very long. He needed some help with it. I hadn't met Larry, but I'd heard about his submitting the play. He wanted Joe to read it straight off the bat, but that hadn't happened. Instead, my literary manager, who was a wonderful guy named Bill Hart, had read it. And although he thought it needed lots of work, in quotes, he gave it to me to read. He was absolutely right. It had a lot of medical statistics in it. They just went on for pages and pages and pages. It'd be like reciting the phone book or something. I mean, they just weren't viable dramatically, but they were obviously great importance to Larry Kramer. He wanted Joe to read it, but that didn't happen. My literary manager read it, and he brought it into me. He said, Gail, this is very, very long script. There's a lot of stuff in it, but he says, I think there are pieces of gold here and there, nuggets of gold that are worth looking at. So I read it and I knew what he was talking about. I felt that it still needed a lot more work. But anyway, I called Larry. I said, let's meet. I never met him before. So when he walked into my office, he had a cute little dog with him. He sat down and I told him everything I liked about it. I thought his biblical rage about the neglect of the AIDS crisis was absolutely amazing. And I agreed with him totally that neglect was something akin to genocide. There were many things and qualities that I liked about his characters and what he had written, despite, these major defects that you could easily point in the play. And I said something to him. I said, you have this character, he says this or that, whatever. He said, I didn't understand what that meant exactly, but maybe you could explain it to me. He said, yes. He said, he whipped out this, lined pad from his briefcase. He started writing furiously. He said, well, the reason you're confused is that's a composite character. And I said, oh, really? I didn't know anything about the gay men's health crisis problem that he'd been through. I didn't know the history of that. So he was conflating two people who had been a part of that real life crisis into one character in the play, and it didn't work for some reason. And apparently my confusion demonstrated that to him in some way. He wrote furiously on this yellow pad. And I said, well, we'll have to get together again and have more discussion. He said, yeah, great. But then I thought I'd call him in about 2 weeks, 3 weeks. The next week he comes back and he wants to sit down and have more discussion. He says, the fact you ask questions, you don't tell me what to do. You ask questions about something you don't understand is what's useful to me. So I said, oh, good. I'm good at asking questions. This will help. There's a lot of stuff I don't understand all the time. So we got into this kind of mode of work where he would come around with his dog and his yellow pad. And I always had questions, I never pretend to understand something. I do have questions. It's kind of the way I operate creatively. That equation proved to be useful to him, and we developed a very fond friendship out of it that lasted all of the years until he died. Despite having created a messy script, everybody said, oh, no, this won't work. He was completely professional when he got to work in the right mood and spirit. He knew exactly what he needed to do. He was not defensive about what he'd written, and he was very smart about what he did. So he would bring in, revised drafts of this play to me. And finally, he came one day with his dog. He was very ebullient. He said, "Oh," he says, "you'll never guess what I did." He says, "I've gotten rid of all the stuff about, the brother and that problem. I'll make another play out of that." I said, "Oh, really?" I said, "Oh, well, that's interesting." So he brought in a script with this new revision of the structure of the play. It was a major, major difference. That was a script I finally asked Joe to read. And although it was still not perfect, what's perfect in life anyway, it was enough that Joe could read it and stick with it. And when he got to the end of the play, he was just as moved as I was about it. My literary manager, Bill Hart, had also come in to work with Larry on it. He was extraordinarily smart in doing that. And then the director, Michael Lindsay Hogg, was very skillful in bringing it all to some kind of shape where he could cast the play and it could go into production. It was a long process, but Larry and I bonded during that period. I was never the object of Larry's famous confrontational behavior. I never got that from him. We were always in sync. I think it's because of that relationship working on the play in the way that we did, Although many other people had explosively confrontational experiences with him, I never had that ever. I felt very close to the play. I have a chapter in my book about it, about that experience. It was received with lukewarm interest by the New York Times. I felt it was an insufficient review. Joe felt that also, as did the cast that finally performed it. So Joe said he was going to run the play as long as he possibly could because he felt it was so important, which he did. It became the longest running play ever at the Public Theater. And then it had over 600 performances in multiple countries all around the world afterwards. It didn't make it to Broadway at that time, but it did 20 years later, and it finally won a Tony Award then. We all felt it very long deserved, and so there was a kind of justice in that. It's an interesting story. The cast was absolutely amazing cast that portrayed all these fascinating men in the play and one female doctor. I was glad that it finally got the recognition that it certainly deserved, which it did finally.
The Public Theater has continued to have some of their productions move to Broadway to great success. Among them are Fun Home, Hamilton, and the recently opened Here Lies Love. What has it been like for you to see the public still going strong to this day?
Well, of course, I feel very happy that it's had these successes. I think the Hamilton success was phenomenal. The Here Lies Love, which is currently running on Broadway after having been done initially a number of years ago at the Public, is very gratifying, as some of the other plays are. Right now, it's hard to describe the course of any theater as writing a course of success in a way that perhaps theaters could in the past. There's no nonprofit theater, which includes the Public Theater, that is riding high at this point. Even with commercial extensions, every nonprofit theater, big and small or middle size, is struggling just to stay alive in this post-pandemic era that we're in, where the theater-going patterns of the past are no longer holding. People are not coming to theater in the way they used to, and the support, foundation and donor support of nonprofit theater that's been part of the role model of nonprofit theaters in the past is not happening the way it used to. Everyone is having to cut back and reduce their operations. Some of the smaller theaters have gone out of business entirely. They're all in a state of distress just to survive. The big theaters are really no different than the smaller theaters, except that they do have more resources to try to stay afloat during difficult times. The Public Theater is in that category. It's determined to survive. It has a wonderful leadership in its artistic director right now, Oscar Eustace, and also in its board leadership, who's Luis Miranda Jr., who is the father of Lin-Manuel Miranda. That leadership is determined to keep the theater going in the future, and it has no plans to cut back or reduce its operations to the point of zero, but it's struggling, and it's had to lay off people, it's had to cut back on its season. The question of success in a nonprofit theater is open to discussion. What is that? The success of a nonprofit theater is staying afloat, is staying in business. How do you do that now? It's very problematic how you do that. If donors and foundations melt away, if the audience melts away, how do you do that? That's what everybody is facing these days.
Well, Gail, I thank you very much for devoting your time to this interview. It was great getting to talk to you.
Thank you. It's been nice to be with you.
Same here, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much. You too.